for the last 40 years, but we're catching up. But you followed that up with saying, quote, the US government doesn't appear to understand what China is planning, and the US is falling further behind rather than catching up. And so how have we misinterpreted or misunderstood what China is and what they represent? And what are some prescriptions you think the United States should do to both understand and catch up and keep a pace and inevitably beat the new China threat?
Well, I make myself unpopular with many of my conservative friends by saying this, Brandon, but although there are many aspects of the Chinese system which I find repugnant and absolutely no aspects of the Chinese system that I like.
Right.
I don't like Chinese food. I don't like Chinese architecture. Nonetheless, what should scare us is not what China is doing wrong, but what they are doing right.
Yes. Yes.
And the Chinese understand that broadband 5G tech for the fourth industrial revolution. So as Paul Scanlon described it to me, you can now, with 5G, which has zero latency, in other words, there's almost no delay in communications, you can put a bunch of industrial robots together in any room and give them, have an AI processor, which allows them to autonomously come up with an industrial process. So flexible manufacturing can one day produce sneakers, the next day produce widgets, the next day produce rebars or whatever. It's an astonishing revolution in manufacturing. Autonomous vehicles. Huawei envisions smart cities. What does a smart city mean? It means you're sitting around in New York City where crosstown traffic takes you 45 minutes to get from First Avenue to 10th Avenue. But then an artificial intelligence server knows where every passenger, every package, and every vehicle is in the city and guides everything. Friction. Huawei's got a study going claiming that this can add 2% a year to economic growth by itself.
Incredible.
Medical technology, we've already covered. So China looks at this fourth industrial revolution and says, we want to dominate it. And if we dominate it, the rest of the world will be our sharecroppers. That's my word, not theirs. We will assimilate you. You depend on our technology. You'll depend on our data. You'll have to come to us. You'll pay us royalties. You'll depend on us. We'll be the dominant power in the world. And this temporary anomaly of, say, 1800 to 20,000, to 2010, where China was humiliated and weak, as opposed to being the middle kingdom, the dominant power in the world, will correct that anomaly. We'll go back to being the dominant power in the world. We will be poorer, less secure, and humiliated. And as an American, I don't like that. They have a vision of the future, and we're playing whack-a-mole with that. And that's why I say we haven't caught up. The thing that scared me the most from the American corporate sector this year is Intel announcing they might entirely give up the fabrication of computer chips. That's an industry we invented. It's all gone to Taiwan and South Korea. Now, not to say anything bad about Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing. It's a great company. They do a fabulous job, and they deserve their elevated stock price. But there is a revolving door of engineers in the mainland, and all it takes is one Chinese spy in a chip factory to put a back door hidden among the billions of transistors in a chip the size of my fingernail to sabotage a whole American industry. So the fact that we have allowed our high-tech manufacturing to move to Asia and become dependent on them, and even our great companies like Intel seem ready to throw in the towel, is a very frightening thing. This should never have been allowed to happen.
Yes. And what you're talking about reminds me of Peter Thiel's supposition that the United States has been very good in the world of bits, but in the world of atoms from the 1960s and 70s, stagnant. And it seems to me, and I'm reminded of something I've heard you say many times before, which is a play on Trotsky. We Americans, you may not be interested in industrial trade policy, but that is very much interested in you. And it seems to me like particularly in the world of stuff or the world of atoms, we tend to be slowing down, and China seems to be honing in on the control points of that, and that is very frightening.
Yes. People say, a lot of my conservative friends don't like the idea of industrial policy. I don't like the idea of industrial policy. Least of all do I like the fact that we have an industrial policy. It is China's industrial policy.
Right.
Asia and will be hollowed out here. It's not simply trade or tariffs and so forth. In that sense, I think Trump's attention has been much too narrowly focused on a very minor part of the problem. The issue is subsidies for capital. And what worries me, Brandon, is that as Peter said, bits versus atoms is not really a good idea. And ultimately, if you don't have the engineers and the skilled workers to test out ideas, you lose the innovation as well. We can subsidize universities all we want, and guys will publish papers, but people in China will read those papers too, and they'll reap the benefits of it.
Yeah, right. So I'm reminded also of the Navy. They've been trying to build this direct, conversation now to the military angle. We hear a lot about, well, we could be inching toward a war with China. And obviously, if God help us, if that did happen, the Navy would be sort of the tip of the spear. And the Navy put in an order over the last couple of years for X amount of submarines. And then in the last year, the Trump administration said we're going to need, I think, 8 or 9 more on top of that. And the shipbuilding firms here in America said we can't even meet the original order. And it's sort of this cognitive dissonance on our part, where we have all of these great, Apple has these great little apps and we design all these cool little software programs. But when it matters, it just seems like, whether we're talking chip manufacturing or even sort of the old school, we need to lay down subs, we don't seem to have that capacity anymore. And I guess we now see from the administration trying to decouple. And I certainly will admit that has been something that I think we should have been doing, 20, 30 years ago. Do you think it may be too little too late?
Well, decoupling certainly makes sense when we're talking about chip manufacturing. All of our sensitive chip manufacturing should be done here under secure circumstances, with everyone in the plant vetted by the FBI. So no question about certain areas of decoupling. However, when our imports from China are now really at an all-time record because of the surge in demand for consumer electronics goods, and they account for more than 20% of our total consumption of manufacturing goods. The idea that we could easily substitute Chinese goods or move this to small countries like Mexico or Vietnam is just fanciful. And in terms of the data, our medical researchers need access to Chinese data. They simply have the biggest data sets in the world. And I don't want to let Americans die of curable diseases because we want to stick it to the Chinese. So there are certain areas where we can't possibly decouple, and other areas where we should massively decouple. We don't have, $10 trillion to reproduce what China is doing. So we need to pick our targets very carefully. The fact that I hate to be a broken record about semiconductors, but we just spent $6 trillion between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve to keep demand up and stabilize credit markets during the COVID-19 crisis. We haven't spent $1 on productive capacity in the United States. So it's fine to talk about decoupling, but we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. I've used the phrase, 10 years and $1 trillion to turn this around.
Yes.
But it's a huge task. And unless we're going to talk about what resources we have and how much money we can spend, and it's got to be a lot, and where it should be targeted, talking about decoupling is just an empty slogan.
Okay. And I think we're now going to switch over now to some of the questions. We've got some really good questions here. You've got a very good audience today. And Peter Treadway writes, this is related to what we've been talking about with semiconductors, not to belabor the point, but Peter Treadway writes, how can China overcome the U.S. semiconductor embargoes? You started to touch on that. Why don't you hit a little bit more on that?
Now, I've spoken to a lot of people in China about this, and of course, a lot of this information is highly classified. But the basic weakness in the American approach is that we can stop China from buying not only American products, but as the Commerce Department insisted starting in July, products made with American technology, which is an assertion of extraterritorial privilege, which we've never used before. But we can't stop the Chinese from hiring anybody they want.
Right.
So what we've done is the main effect of our chip technology embargo has been to drastically raise the compensation of Taiwanese and Korean chip engineers. Mm-hmm. The Chinese will double the salary of people who know how to build this capacity. And by some estimates, 20% of all of Taiwan's chip fabrication engineers are now working on the mainland, scrambling to do things. Now, there are certain areas where clearly the Chinese will be hit. They can't produce 5 or 7 nanometer chips. That's the most advanced chip that's required for, say, the kind of smartphone chip that allows you to do top-of-the-line slow motion in your smartphone. But for the kind of things that Huawei requires for its carrier business, that's the base stations that build out 5G broadband, much older chips will do the job. So we won't, I don't see us holding back China's 5G rollout. People at Huawei whom I've spoken to are quite confident that although their handset business may be impaired, the carrier business, that's the 5G business, and the cloud business will not be impaired. And as you pointed out at the beginning, Brandon, we're kind of in the position of Britain in the 19th century, trying to stop the United States from acquiring our technology. They were doing the same with Germany. It's never worked. At best, it has a short-term effect. But in the case of chip production technology, America has many, but not all, of the best machines for producing chips. And certainly the best software for designing and testing chips. But we're not the only ones anymore. There now, for every step in the chip production process, there exists a Japanese, South Korean, Chinese, or European alternative. So it's already possible to create a production line with zero American technology that will produce chips down to, say, maybe 11 nanometers, not the 5 or 7. And give it 5 or 10 years. If the Chinese put enough resources into it, it'll be possible to do anything. And the result very well may be that American companies are shut out of the market because nobody wants to buy American equipment if they can't use it according to whatever commercial purpose they please. So nobody is more aghast at the tech war than the chip industry. Semiconductor Industry Association is the biggest lobby, warning that all this will do is to force massive amounts of R&D onto the Chinese side and take it away from the United States. And that's in their public comment on the Commerce Department's ruling from last July. So we could talk about that all day, but in a nutshell, that's how I see it.
Well, that's very interesting, and so I love talking to you. I get a different perspective than what we normally get from the media these days. David Bicknell writes. He asks, "What U.S. companies are responding best to the challenge posed by China's advances?"
Well, I think we have spectacularly good chip technology companies. Companies like NVIDIA and Qualcomm are certainly the world's best. I think Google is the world's best computation company. They've spent amazing amounts to acquire the best talent in computer science. And I don't think anything in China compares to that. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, has been telling anyone who will listen to him that we still have an advantage. We have advantage in technology for quantum computing and for processing. but we stand to lose that because China's spending, I think their current budget is $1.4 trillion for technology subsidies in the next 5 years, which dwarfs anything we're doing. In areas like quantum computing, which you mentioned, which may be the key technology of the future, Arthur Herman at the Hudson Institute estimates that China is outspending us 10 to 1.
Yeah.
So although we have the best talent here and the best companies and the best technology, the mass of Chinese financial capital and human capital, because they're a very big country with a lot of smart people and a big university system staffed by PhDs, and we trained here.
Right.
If they continue at this kind of pace, and we continue doing little, it will be a tortoise and a hare kind of race. Mm-hmm. The tortoise will win.
Right. And this sort of now links in this next question from Greg Lawson. We spoke a little bit about decoupling and kind of the administration's pushing for that. We also know the Trump administration has been much tougher on immigration policy across the board, I guess the education policy in this country, we've seen sort of this slowdown in educating people properly. Whether you're talking about the college campuses with all the protests or just to look at the K through 12 curricula, it's not that impressive anymore. Greg asks, should America redirect most of its higher education spending to STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, and pure research and development? What do you think about that?
Newt Gingrich says to end is not our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is our educational system.
Right.
Only 5% of American undergraduates major in engineering. In China and Russia, the number is 1/3. So Russia graduates in absolute terms more engineers per year than the United States does, even with a much smaller young population, because the proportion of engineering students is so much larger. Without immigrants, we wouldn't be able to staff our tech industries. Mm-hmm. And the problem goes all the way from K through 12 up through doctoral programs, because our high schools are not producing enough graduates who are qualified to enter a high-level engineering program. So we need educational reforms from beginning to end. In fact, after Sputnik, when we still had Sputnik moments, Eisenhower passed or proposed and got passed the National Defense Education Act, which vastly increased scientific education so that by 1969, we reached our all-time peak in absolute number of engineers in the United States. Now, as a temporary stopgap, we need immigrants. I want to win. I want to win with whoever we can. We fight the war with the army available. And my view is very different from that of the Trump administration in terms of immigration. There are lots of Chinese who'd much rather raise their kids in freedom. I don't believe that we're in any position to affect regime change in China, and that to attempt this would be a quixotic and dangerous thing. But in a country of 1.4 billion people, particularly among the most educated, there are millions and millions who do not like living in an authoritarian regime. So if we had a serious program to engineer a brain drain and recruit Chinese who are amenable to our way of life and would like to raise their families in freedom, I have no doubt that we could pick off some of their best minds, deprive them of their talents, and do the same thing here. I mean, remember, I think it was one of Churchill's military aides who said, we won World War II because our German scientists were better than their German scientists.
That's right.
So there's a great precedent from picking off the enemy's best talent and using them to win.
And, I know we know some mutual people in the Trump team, and I've been very pro-Trump, and I think he was right to bring up the illegal immigration issue, but I've always been a little bit more personally reticent to get too tough on some of the higher educational stuff, because let's face it, we need all the talent we can get. And as you noted, beginning in the 90s, really, China sent their first generation of PhD types to come study here. And then they went home and built out the infrastructure they needed to basically, essentially, indigenously, ultimately train their people there, so they don't have to even send as many to the West anymore, which has always been a Chinese strategic aim, which is to be completely as self-reliant as possible. And so I think we've allowed a critical strategic gap to form that we should not have. And as you say, I mean, look, I write about the space program, and well, let's face it, we brought in a lot of Nazis at the end of the war, and they really catapulted our space program to leaps and bounds that I don't think we would have been able to in the time frame that we ended up doing that. And Werner von Braun obviously is the most.
I used to run into the late Tom Wolfe occasionally at a supper club that we both attended in New York, and I teased him that The Right Stuff was the most pernicious and dangerous book of the second half of the 20th century. He said, well, why? I said, because it gave us the idea that a bunch of tobacco chewing, good old boys won the space race, as opposed to a bunch of Nazi scientists who would be important.
They certainly, having been raised in the South, the good old boys certainly had their role, but it was a fusion, right? It was a fusion of the foreign brain and sort of the brawn and the Southerners. But you're right. Just seeing here, the Fabio, and forgive me, I cannot pronounce the last name. I think it's Sakatsume, writes, great subject matters being discussed. Congratulations. In the West, he asks, who will win and who will lose or be afraid with the raising of Chinese economic political model?
Well, that is the Thucydides trap problem. Graham Allison, professor at Harvard, wrote a book called The Thucydides Trap, in which he argued, in my view, inaccurately, that wars always start because a challenger comes along and the established power doesn't like it. So Athens is the challenger, Sparta is the established power, you have the Peloponnesian War, Germany is the challenger, Britain is the established power, you get World War I, and so forth. I took issue with many aspects of his book, but it's certainly the case that the United States doesn't like losing. And the first response of the intelligence and security establishment is, let's slap down the Chinese and put them in their place.
Right.
The problem is that the Chinese have shown themselves to be flexible and resilient and have gotten around most of the barriers we've put in front of them. And I think, in fact, as we were just discussing, trying to stop people from developing technology has never been a winning strategy. Right. Staying ahead of them by developing better. I don't wish them ill. I wish us much better. Yes. Unfortunately, you look at the way the administration has dealt with some of the hot button issues. TikTok's a great example. The president says, we've got to stop TikTok. There is a strategic issue in TikTok. As we discussed, 2 billion installations of an app gives you a data set like none other in the world. But as Larry Ellison and other people in the tech industry prevailed on Trump, simply shutting this off would hurt us more than it would hurt the Chinese. So something of a compromise was hammered together, but we'll see whether it holds or not. Even with the chip restrictions on Huawei, AMD and Intel got licenses to export chips to Huawei. So our ability to run a tech war is limited by the fact that, to some extent, we risk shooting ourselves in the foot. Yeah. So we either have to reconcile ourselves to mediocrity and a second place in the world, like Britain did, or we have to do the kind of things which would, repeat our success in the Cold War, in the arsenal of democracy, and the space race against a much bigger opponent than we've had in the past, and coming from a weaker position than we had in the past. Though it's arguable in 1940, after 10 years of depression, we were pretty weak. So we came back a lot faster than anyone imagined possible.
And, it's an interesting concept, because I think we in the United States have always thought that, well, our democratic system gives us a lot of abilities to be adaptive and to sort of come from behind, and it certainly has. But my concern is, at some point, you're so far behind, you can't come back, and that's what my worry is with sort of some of our policies that we've had with China. And it seems like there's Peter Catalano had written at the start of the program. His question, I think, is interesting, because we talk a lot about what China's doing right. But his question, I think, is good. Is has Xi Jinping's absolutist regime become a liability for the long-term Chinese grand strategy?
In some respects, yes. There are reformers who would like to move more aggressively towards market mechanisms in a number of areas, and they view Xi as something of a provincial bullet head, old-fashioned party boss who doesn't quite get it. So
how we view our politicians.
I think there are many people in China who would say that Xi has been something of a liability. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, he seems to have adopted a lot of the reformers' program in recent weeks. So, for example, if you look at the opening of the Chinese financial system, the IPO market in Shanghai, the STARS market, is now churning out billionaires every week. So the availability of capital for entrepreneurs has been improved substantially. There's been a reform which allows insurance companies and pension funds to hold a much higher level of equities. The Chinese have in the past been a bit suspicious of an open capital market, because an open capital market really is a kind of democracy. If you depend on the citizens of your country to vote on the value of government bonds and the value of stocks and grade your performance, that constitutes a popular check on what you're able to do. So although I prefer full-fledged Republican democracy in the United States, free capital markets do allow a certain amount of popular sovereignty. And that's why communist regimes are opposed to them. So the Chinese have been moving in that direction, less aggressively than many of the reformers would like. So it's very hard for me on the outside to evaluate how important President Xi is within the State Council. It is a collective leadership. You don't have a hereditary emperor. It is like a Politburo, but the State Council is actually more important in policymaking than the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know how much individuals say he has or how much he's dependent on a group of thinkers. All I can do is look at the results. And in fact, China's done reasonably well. They've been able to get a V-shaped recovery without massive monetary stimulus and without massive government spending. Their spending has increased, but not nearly as much as in the West. And they seem to be very good at generating a pipeline of high-tech IPOs in many fields and making public financing available for the high-tech side of the economy. So in general, I'd have to say Xi, on the balance of what I see, I think the answer to the question is Xi been a liability, not a decisive one, because he seems to be flexible and adaptive.
And I think it should be noted, at least in my assessment, I've written about this, even if Xi Jinping were to go away tomorrow, you still have to deal with, as you just noted, the Communist Party apparatus. And, even if somehow the CCP were to vanish, it's not a fait accompli that some Republican democracy would arise in its place. That's sort of the great lesson of the last 20 years is, many people in American foreign policy circles assume that democracy is written on everyone's hearts. Maybe it's not. It's a cultural thing. So I think it's important to point that out as well.
I think that point is important to emphasize. China's been run by an elite selected by standardized exams for at least 2,300 years. Right. You can see ancient engravings of people sitting taking the Mandarin exam 2,000 years ago, and it's not much different from the 10 million kids who take the Gaokao in China every year now.
Yep.
So the Chinese Communist Party really is another incarnation of the ancient Mandarin elite. That's how China's been run. When you talk to Chinese officials, they say, we don't understand what you're doing in the United States. You allow people to elect stupid people to public office. How can you do that? They haven't gone to a top university. They don't have a doctorate. I mean, they're not intelligent. How can you do that? And I said, well, you know, Bill Buckley said he'd rather be governed by the first 100 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than the faculty of Harvard, and so would I. I want everyone to have a choice. And they said, but, you know, we don't think that's a very good way of doing things. And that is a difference we're not going to overcome easily. There are Chinese who are real Democrats, but if they've got a doctorate in electrical engineering, I'd much rather have them here than in China.
Right. And I see that we're coming up on the almost 11 a.m. mark, and I'm going to ask one more question. We seem to be getting a lot of questions in about sort of structural changes within the international system. Certainly the last 4 years in particular have been momentous changes. We've seen in response to the COVID outbreak, at least in my assessment, it seems like there might be some stumbling blocks coming up for China. We spoke about their outreach to the Europeans with 5G, but we do seem to see the formation, at least in my view, of a Quad alliance. Australia in particular has almost completely done a 180 from where they were 8 months ago, which was to be very conciliatory and accommodationist with China. It seems like now we're actually seeing Australia and India, Japan to a degree, and of course the United States now really kind of, it seems like, starting to try to put a roadblock, at least in the military realm, to China. Do you think that there's any chance of success that a Quad alliance could in fact at least slow down China's rise? Is this the right direction we're going in, or have we completely missed the mark, as you seem to have indicated? You know, is this something that we should be okay with? Is the creation of this Quad alliance?
Well, it's certainly trying to align other countries to limit China's power is inevitably what American policy has to be.
Right.
The attitude of our Asian friends towards China and the United States has always been ambivalent. They always hedge their bets. They always play both sides.
Right.
Japanese, for example, there was a terrific article in Asia Times a few months ago by Stephen Bryan, former senior Pentagon official, excellent defense analyst, pointing out that it was really a decisive back down on the part of the Japanese to refuse to deploy land-based Aegis missiles to defend American forces in Japan. That was a key Chinese demand. So on some of the most important things, the Japanese have really backed down on previous commitments they'd made to us. And that's really by far the most important thing. I mean, Australia are great friends of ours. The Australians are more like us than any people in the world, but there are exactly 18 million of them. They're half the size of a large Chinese city altogether. They're not an important force. Japan, as you know, is the strongest military power in the Northern Pacific, and if it wanted to, could be by far the strongest military power. I have no doubt that in a naval and air confrontation, the Japanese would make chop meat of what the Chinese have in the air or on the sea. But there's no indication that the Japanese want to get into a situation which might ultimately lead them into a war with China, which would be devastating for both of them. Taiwan is obviously the critical area. Japan has deep interest in Taiwan. It used to occupy Taiwan. More Taiwanese speak Japanese than English, really. It's enormous Japanese presence there. So if China were to invade Taiwan, I think Japan would be forced to take sides against it. As long as that situation is kept on a low boil, I think the Japanese are going to play both ways. My view, and I know I sound like a broken record, is that if we want our allies to come home wagging their tails behind them and align with us, we have to make clear to them that we have an absolutely decisive advantage in military technology. For example, China's biggest military advantage is a large number of surface-to-ship missiles. Whether they can take out American aircraft carriers is a controversial issue, but I don't think any American aircraft carrier skipper really wants to find out for sure.
Right.
China's spent a vast amount of money to try to basically exercise access denial within several hundred miles of the coast. Now, we do have anti-missile technology.
Right.
Lasers can shoot down any kinetic object, but we are years away from being able to guide and track and keep a laser on target long enough to knock down a missile. If we had a crash program which advanced that technology and we could neutralize China's missile advantage, I think the impression that would make on the Japanese would be decisive.
Right. And certainly I would hope the Space Force would pioneer that, but thus far I haven't really seen that surge of interest in space-based missile defense, which is very tragic. It's something that I've been pushing for, and I know you have as well.
Yes, and for those of you who came late, Brandon's book is Winning Space, and if you want to know about that, please buy it.
Thank you. And well, we're coming up on 11 a.m., and so
we can run over a few minutes if there are more questions.
We got some great questions here. So we're talking a little bit more now about the geopolitics. And Greg Lawson asks, is there potential utility to, quote, reverse Nixon to China tilt with Russia? Does Russia still have any scientific innovations we could use and try to block from their sharing with China? And actually, real quick, Greg does make a great point, because as I track in my book, the more hard we push against Moscow, inevitably we see this with Roscosmos and the Chinese space agency, the Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. We see them getting closer together. And the nightmare scenario, whether we're talking about geopolitics or we're talking about the space program, is to have those two great Eurasian powers working together. And so I think Greg Lawson's question is very apt.
Yeah, none of these terrible things would be happening if Henry Kissinger were still alive. One of the great American diplomatic accomplishments in all of our history was Nixon, of course, Kissinger, though it was Nixon's idea, approach to China in 1973, which broke up the Russian-Chinese alliance and gave us enormous strategic flexibility. And as you say, Russia and China have had a rapprochement, not just in the space program, but, for example, in many other areas. 5G is an example. Huawei is building out all of Russia's 5G program and has moved a great deal of its R&D to Russia. Russia has a lot of great engineers.
Yes.
That's one of the reasons why Israel is a technological pocket superpower, because of the Russian immigration.
Yeah.
That is a grave mistake on our part. I have nothing good to say about Vladimir Putin. He runs his method of rule I find repugnant. The only thing I will say is there is no ruler of Russia I can think of who is much better. Nobody talks about Ivan the Reasonable.
Right.
So I think our utopian view, our high dudgeon that Russia didn't become a Western-style democracy after the fall of communism, which infected the Clinton administration and went through the Obama administration, has led us to push Russia into a corner in a way that doesn't benefit us. I am not I'm not saying that we should condone Putin's method of rule. I'm simply saying, as an America firster, it's not our job to fix Russia's problem. The Russian people are going to have to do that if and when they decide to do so. So I agree. The sanctions against Russia have certainly had the unintended consequence of pushing Russia and China closer together. There are only 3 economies that count right now on the Eurasian continent. India may in the future, but right now India's per capita GDP is a fifth of China's, and its manufacturing capacity is extremely limited. So India is a future economy of importance. Right now, there are three places that count. That's Russia, China, and Germany. Germany does not seem well disposed to the idea of kicking Huawei out of its 5G networks.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you have an economic lineup of Russia, China, and Germany, that is really a terrible idea. By the way, I've been asked to clarify that Dr. Kissinger is in fact still alive. I was only kidding.
I was gonna. Yes, I should have clarified that.
And I wish him many more years of health.
Yes, I should have made the audience aware of that. That's my bad. You were joking.
Yes.
It looks like we have another question about Taiwan, which we've touched on, but does Taiwan? This is from Mark Defeedy, I think, Difede. Does Taiwan have any chance of avoiding assimilation into China's collective? And might China make a move on them in the next year?
China has a very long-term view and is patient. China gets enormous benefits out of Taiwan. Remember, Taiwan is a country of about, 27 million people? Mm-hmm. And its talents and accomplishment are vastly out of proportion to its size.
Kind of like Israel, how it just is this
sure.
outside.
I mean, China is, Taiwan is smaller than a large Chinese city. It's smaller than Shanghai or Chengdu or Chongqing. It's a, and if you look at what they've accomplished in technology, leading the world in chip fabrication, that's a huge resource of skills for China. If China were to conquer Taiwan, it would destroy the economy. It would cause the best people to emigrate. It would ruin Taiwan's contribution to the Chinese economy. So that's something the Chinese would only do if they felt they had to, because it would not be to their advantage. Just like Hong Kong, it's good for the Chinese to have little pockets which technically belong to them, but really don't. So free markets and entrepreneurship can flourish outside the shadow of the Chinese authoritarian system. So why would China invade Taiwan? Well, China, it's important to realize China is not a country, it is an empire. If we're nationalists in the United States, they're the perfect anti-nationalist. 200 languages are spoken, including 6 major language groups. There are 80 major ethnicities. They're held together by a central power structure, by the Mandarin elite, by infrastructure, which the country does need. But the Chinese don't really like China in particular. So the nightmare of every Chinese government has been a rebel province that leads to a breakup of the country. The Chinese, it's not just simply a matter of Taiwan or Hong Kong or Tibet. China, as a matter of its own credibility, for its own integrity, cannot take, and no government can or will take the risk of a breakup. So if something happens that forces the issue, where the issue is Taiwan becomes independent or China invades, China absolutely will invade. So the best case scenario is to let Taiwan flourish as a democracy, accept the formalism of a one China policy, but do nothing and hope that over time China evolves, the mainland evolves in such a way as to be less oppressive to this island of democracy and free markets and entrepreneurship that's Taiwan.
And it's very interesting. I'm someone who's been following. I'm very interested in strategic warnings and surprise. Roberta Wallstetter, her book has been, an inspiration to me. She, of course, wrote I think the definitive history of basically how we missed Pearl Harbor. Michelle Wucker has talked about the gray rhino. Frank Hoffman talks about the pink flamingo, which basically these are events that we can see down the line, but we just ignore because we think they're not that important until they're upon us, and it's a crisis. you are not concerned that there may be a significant degree of strategic miscalculation on the part of China's leadership. We're seeing sort of the pressure being applied to them. Ed Lutback talks a lot about great state autism as he sees it in China, where basically the Chinese leadership doesn't really understand some of the intricacies of posturing from the West. So you're not concerned that there is a chance for a miscalculation vis-a-vis Taiwan and China?
Well, the question is what would trigger it? If, for example, the United States gave F-35s to Taiwan and stationed American troops there, as John Bolton proposes, that conceivably might be such a provocation. I don't think we should do that. And I think Bolton is a hothead and that Trump was absolutely right to fire him because he is a hothead. I think he's well-meaning, but I think his judgment was poor in this case. So yes, there absolutely is. But it is remarkable how opaque the Chinese Communist Party leadership is, how absolutely dumb they can be about looking at the West. Right. They're as bad at understanding us as we are at understanding them, in fact, by force. And the term paranoid Chinese, when it applies to the leadership, is a pleonasm. Their view of the world is entirely paranoid because in an authoritarian state, you can't do anything except by conspiracy. So yes, there is an important aspect of misperceptions, and China, in its dealings with the world, has been bullying, aggressive, nasty, and has created a lot of ill will simply because of the kind of people they are and the way they behave. So yes, there is a risk, but for the time being, I think the risk is relatively limited. And the main basis I have for making that assertion is the nature of China's military posture. China has spent vast amounts of money. By the way, that's the opposite of the recommendations in this famous book, Unrestricted Warfare. Massive amounts of money in high-tech defensive weaponry, particularly missiles, submarines, and other ways of defending their coasts. They don't have a lot of force projection capability. For example, China, with 1.4 billion people, has between 7,000 and 15,000 special forces total. We have 75,000. Last time I checked the Pentagon budget. So they don't. The PLA doesn't own any ground attack aircraft. Nothing like the A-10 Warthog. It's a really lousy ground army because they don't have a lot to do with it. But their missile forces are better than ours.
And they have been developing, amphibious capabilities. I mean, my only concern is that we're missing something here, and it seems like right now there seems to be a crisis point, and China certainly has gotten a lot more, I think, aggressive outwardly than they have in the last maybe 30 years with us. And so that's my only kind of concern is when I see that. But I guess the next question we may have here is in relation to energy, and this is from Mark Heidel, and energy is another issue that I'm always interested in. He asks, given the future requirements for energy, does China have an advantage in fields like molten salt fission or fusion?
China's putting a lot of money into nuclear fusion. It's not an area I'm followed very closely. I would refer to an excellent series in Asia Times by our science editor, Dr. Jonathan Tenenbaum. And they certainly are doing more in fission reactors and more innovation in fission reactors than anyone else in the world. China, though, for the time being, is vastly dependent on hydrocarbons. They're the world's largest importer of oil from anywhere, and from the Persian Gulf in particular. So barring some unexpected technological breakthrough, the geopolitics of oil will continue to be an important consideration for China's foreign policy and projection of power in the world. This is not going to change quickly. I mean, it takes a long time to build enough nuclear power plants to take the edge off oil consumption.
Yeah, and I think to answer that question also, I think your book is helpful, even if you don't you're not an energy expert, but your book is helpful because you identify the pattern of how China looks at an industry and how they seek to sort of dominate it. I think that's the key thing here. And the same patterns that we see in biotech or quantum, we see obviously in alternative energy. Dr. Jim Rice, formerly of NASA, is a colleague of mine, and he gave me a wonderful blurb for my book. But he first got a hold of me because his area is space-based solar power, and he said that he's been doing these conferences, international conferences, for many years on behalf of NASA. And he said that in the last 5 years, all of a sudden, he said all of the Chinese delegation, all they want to do is talk about space-based solar power. And so we know that the Chinese are very interested in alternative energy. And I think the same pattern that you identify with their interest in the other technological areas, I think would easily be applied to any kind of high-tech industry.
Yes. By the way, I've had another message service a question from Carice Whitty, who is the head of Signal. It's an organization that specializes in Chinese-Israeli relations, on whose advisory board I sit. So in that sense, she's my boss, and I should respond. What is the importance of the inclusion of Chinese sovereign bonds in the world bond indices maintained by FTSE Russell? I think it's very important. China has a $15 trillion fixed income market, second only to America's, but it's the only fixed income market in the world which offers positive real yields for high quality debt at this point. So inflows into Chinese markets have been enormous, running about $250 billion a year as of July. I think they'll increase because Chinese currency has been stable, if anything, with a rising bias. So China's financial power will grow simply because with a strong and growing economy and some financial reforms which open up access and transparency to foreign investors, they're offering real yields which the world wants, which can't be obtained anywhere else. So attempts to try to restrict China's access to capital markets, which have been bruited about in Washington, are running against, let's say, a very powerful tide.
And we're coming up on the end here. Is there, these have been some great questions from the audience, and thank you so much for having me. Is there any closing remarks, any kind of final thought you'd like the audience to walk away from this phenomenal new book of yours?
Well, thank you very much, Brandon.
Thank you.
I think it's important to remember that the United States has seemed to be in the dumps in the past. I'm an old guy, and I remember vividly Robin Williams, nightclub actor in the 1970s. He'd say, "Now I'm going to do an impression of Jimmy Carter addressing the United States on the eve of World War III." Williams would say, "That's all. Good night. You're on your own."
That's good.
And after Jimmy Carter's Malaise speech, that's how we talk about it. And, Paul Kennedy at Yale was writing books about the decline of the United States. Declinism was everywhere.
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger believed that the Russians would win the Cold War. Every European I know thought that. Everyone thought the United States was done. Yeah. Russia was going to win. And then along came Ronald Reagan and the military buildup and the supply side tax cuts and SDI. And 10 years later, no more communism.
Yeah. And it was the end of history.
The only people, then the same people who thought there was plenty of history said, okay, no more history. Sadly, we still have plenty of history currently and ahead of us. So the only people I knew back then who believed the United States could win were a handful of sort of outsiders around Ronald Reagan who sounded like certifiable lunatics matched against the conventional wisdom. So I've seen pessimism and breastfeeding and down in the dumps before. I think the United States' greatest advantage has never been the fact that we're smarter than other people. We sure aren't, and certainly not more sophisticated, not more forward thinking, but it's that we have a political system which is more amenable to people with a talent for innovation and entrepreneurship than any other in the world. And to the extent that we can become, the home of freedom-loving people and draw the kind of immigrants from China and elsewhere that we used to, say, from Germany when Hitler was running things, we can still beat them. When I say beat them, we can still be the number one power in the world. I don't want to ruin China. As I said, I want China to be prosperous, secure, and much weaker than us.
Right.
That, in my view, is Chinese talk about win-win. That's win-win. Let's us dominate the innovations. Let China struggle to catch up with us.
Yes. Yes. I like that. That's excellent. That's excellent. Well, your book it should be required reading in the defense and intelligence agencies. I just think it's excellent. And I suspect, since we're at the start of a new decade, I think this could end up being one of the most important foreign policy books written in the 2020s. Let's just hope we can embrace your ideas. I think they're very good. And I really appreciate this opportunity and being able to talk to you about this.
Many thanks, Brad. We'll have you back so I can say the same nice things about your book.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.